where was it? Okay, yeah. Let's talk about the Hammer horror stuff now. Let's start with Curse of Frankenstein because, as I said last time we talked about this, that was the first movie that came out for Hammer horror that really just, I mean, it did incredibly well. As I said before, the actors have said that the execs told them, Universal execs told them, because of course Hammer horror did it, but Universal distributed it in the United States, and they said that this movie helped them from going under, from going bankruptcy. And I pointed out that's the third time now that the monsters have helped Universal uh, avoid bankruptcy. The Universal monsters certainly helped after the Depression, started with the Dracula, Frankenstein, all of that. Then it was when Abbott and Costello met the monsters, a new huge wave of success. And then with Hammer horror, bringing back these monsters. So Curse of Frankenstein was so big. Of course, they greenlit to do a Dracula movie, but they made a deal with Universal distributors and whatnot for so many more movies for Hammer to make. And one of those movies was supposed to be a sequel to Curse of Frankenstein. So they had to get a sequel going. And in the Curse of Frankenstein, Christopher Lee, he did not want to be pigeonholed as this character. He didn't even want to come back as Dracula. We'll talk about that in a second, but they just constantly had to lure him back and back and back. But his deal about playing Frankenstein's monster in Curse of Frankenstein, which he did perfectly, we've already talked about that, was that, okay, the creature has to die or be destroyed in a way that he's not going to come back, because Christopher Lee didn't want to keep coming back as the creature. And at the end, he's, spoiler alert, he gets dropped in a vat of acid, which just, eats him up, disintegrates him. So there's no part of him that can be brought back as a Christopher Lee portrayed Frankenstein's monster. So Dr. Baron von Frankenstein, Peter Cushing's character, is the one who continues in the Frankenstein sequels, and that's what makes the Hammer horror Frankenstein movies. Now, with these sequels, I'm only going to talk about them up to 1970, because for both Frankenstein and Dracula, by the time you reach 1970, they're doing something different with both of those franchises. We are going to talk about those, but for the sake of time-wise, I want to keep those to next week. Because for Frankenstein, they rebooted the original one. Then they came back and did another one, Peter Cushing, but that's all after 1970. And then by the time you get to the Dracula movies after 1970, it's Dracula AD, putting it in modern times and stuff like that. So we'll talk about that later, but I just want to talk about the sequels up to that point. Revenge of Frankenstein was the first Peter Cushing Frankenstein sequel, and it took place right off the end of Curse of Frankenstein. It's a true sequel. It's continuing the story. And we know at the end of Curse of Frankenstein, and you know this at the very beginning of Curse of Frankenstein, so it's not even a spoiler. The movie starts with him in jail, about to be guillotined. He's got the death penalty because of all this stuff that happened. And he calls forth this priest who would at least listen to his story and tell him the story. And he's going to try to, see, it wasn't really my fault or whatever. He's not even really confessing, because as we said, Baron von Frankenstein, Victor Frankenstein in these movies, he's the real monster. Total sociopath. I mean, just evil guy. Completely has fun at the expense of others, and their pain is amusing to him. All he cares about is his work. All he cares about is the science. So at the very beginning of Revenge of Frankenstein, that's true to form, right? And this is all the beginning of the movie. But he makes a deal with this like hunchback executioner, Carl, they said, I'll help you. I'll put your brain in a healthy body that's not hunchback if you help me survive this. So what do? They end up killing the priest. I think it's supposed to be the same priest from the first movie. And at the time when Baron von Frankenstein is supposed to be beheaded, no, they behead the priest instead and bury his body where Frankenstein's body should be buried. So that's pretty horrific. But my problem with the rest of the Revenge of the Frankenstein movie, it's a fun movie to watch, and it's got some really cool themes and whatnot. And I have this problem with the next three Frankenstein movies, really, is that Baron von Frankenstein isn't so much of a monster. Some movies have other monstrous people in it. Each movie has some sort of creature he's creating, but some of them aren't all that monstrous either. But he kind of loses his sociopathic, oh my gosh, this dude's evil. He kind of loses that. It's not until Frankenstein must be destroyed that he regains it. And he's like, oh, this dude is dark. But in Revenge of Frankenstein, he goes to this other village. Now, you don't even know how much of this plot involving killing the priest was even in Baron von Frankenstein's head, but it's what happens at the beginning. So you're like, okay, that's horrible. But after that, he goes to this village and he opens up a hospital for the poor. and all the while keeping his you know laboratory elsewhere with Carl the Hunchback there to help him, and other people. I won't give you the whole way thing through, but he's putting together this body to put Carl's brain in and everything. I think Carl was probably the name is probably a throwback to Dwight Fry's character from Bride of Frankenstein. Um, he does, like, at one point he has to amputate a guy's arm in the hospital that he runs for the poor, and of course he takes the arm back to his laboratory because he's going to use that as raw materials, but they don't really spell it out. Like, that would be pretty dark if he was in his hospital for the poor, if he was like needlessly amputating people's body parts or needlessly replacing our organ transplant or something like that so he could take them and gather materials for his experiments. That would be really dark, but the movie doesn't even really show that. He's just so fixated on his work, and what his work is helping Carl. So he's like he's not a good guy, but he's not a monster in these movies. And in the first couple 2 or 3 movies, he's just not that bad of a guy. Again, not a good guy, not somebody you want to trust or but just not a horrible person. And the reason that's a problem is because if you're not going to make the creature super terrifying and super monstrous, and you're going to make Baron von Frankenstein the one be that. That's what the beauty of the Curse of Frankenstein movie was like. And then they just kind of dropped it. They just kind of trolled off of it. Revenge of Frankenstein is interesting, though, and noteworthy because it sets up this precedent, which is interesting. It's not really explored in some of the later movies, but I thought it was interesting nonetheless. But it doesn't matter what kind of body you put the brain in. The brain is going to, the body is going to reflect however the brain thinks of itself. So the healthy, and again, spoiler alert, maybe just mute yourself if you don't want to hear this right there for Revenge of Frankenstein, but the perfect, healthy, upright body that he puts Carl's brain in, by the end ends up hunchback because Carl's brain is a hunchbacked brain, or whatever. That's the way he thinks of himself. And he doesn't really stick to the healing regimen that Frankenstein gives for him anyway. So it was interesting. Now, at the end of Revenge of Frankenstein, I did find it interesting that Frankenstein himself is mortally wounded. So his assistant, Hans, puts his brain in another body that Frankenstein has created there. And by the end, it's still Peter Cushing. So that's never really explained. Like, how did you get another body that looks exactly like you? But you see the scar, and so it could have been explained. They could have said, well, your brain knew that this is what you look like, so it sort of morphed your body. Or he could have extensively did some cosmetic surgery or whatever to make that body look like his. But then you'd probably see scars in the face. I don't know, kind of like Hush from Batman or something. But it was just an interesting concept that by the end of Revenge of Frankenstein, the doctor had become the creature. That's pretty fascinating. So Revenge of Frankenstein, interesting themes, interesting things going on. It's not a poorly done movie. It just drops the ball in what had made Curse of Frankenstein so interesting. So I thought that was weird. Next up, I think, was The Evil of Frankenstein, if I'm getting these right. This was an interesting one, but still, Baron von Frankenstein. It's just interesting to note, though, that after Revenge of Frankenstein, none of the Frankenstein movies are really true sequels. They don't take place or reference the exact events of the last movie. They're all just sort of thematic sequels. Like in Evil of Frankenstein, he goes back to the first village, and there's a burgermeister who had stolen his stuff and all of this and that. They do use pretty much the first castle setting, but they don't really reference the actual events that happen. It's sort of a alternate universe sequel. That's what all the rest of the Frankenstein movies are, pretty much. The cool thing about Evil of Frankenstein, though, is that they had the rights at that point to actually use the universal likeness. So I think they got this like wrestler or whatever to come in and play the creature, and he looks a little bit more like the Universal with the bolts and the box head and everything. But the makeup's really bad, and it's one of the worst creatures. It's one of the worst Frankenstein monsters, actually, just because of like the makeup just wasn't good. I think they were trying to do something original and unique, even though they finally had the rights to go back and do the Boris Karloff. It was weird. I do like though about Evil of Frankenstein that suddenly the experiment that brings the monster to life is much more electric. It's much more lightning based. It's much more because they've got the rights to, kind of evoke some of that same imagery. In Curse of Frankenstein, and I like this about Curse of Frankenstein because they had to do something different, it's much more chemical based. You see all the chemicals in the tubes, and there's some electricity involved. They got the little generator thing going, but it's much more chemical based, and the creatures in this sort of vat of chemicals, and there's none of the cool like raised up to the roof, the cool stuff from the first one. But you get a little bit more of that in The Evil of Frankenstein. It's so ironically titled, though, The Evil of Frankenstein, because again, in this movie, Baron von Frankenstein isn't evil. He's 100% fixated on his work. He wants revenge on the police and the people who had taken his stuff and, banished him from the town. But there's a mesmerist, there's a circus mesmerist that comes in, and he has to have him help him tame his creature. He's the evil one. He's the one wanting to send the creature out to kill his enemies and all this kind of stuff. It's not Baron von Frankenstein. Baron von Frankenstein, he's kind to this mute woman, this mute girl that stays around the castle too. Again, he's not a good guy, but he's just not the evil sociopathic Baron von Frankenstein we met in The Curse of Frankenstein. So it's weird. But again, there's still interesting things about the movie make it worth watching if you're a Frankenstein fan. Jump to Frankenstein Created Woman, the next one. They did this series of photos, promotional photos for Frankenstein Created Woman, which makes you think this is going to be like a Bride of Frankenstein type movie or something. I mean, she's there like just wrapped, around her, breasts and pelvic, area. So she's like, practically naked, stepping off of the contraption, and he's there, holding her as his creation or something. And you're thinking, oh, all right, I know this is going to get the Hammer treatment. But those shots aren't even in the movie at all. The movie's actually a really interesting take. Again, Baron von Frankenstein isn't evil. He's just fixated on his work. It's almost like this movie doesn't even acknowledge that any of the earlier movies happened. It's like this is his first creation, this woman. But he's got this assistant. He's got two assistants, but he's got this young assistant who gets himself into trouble. He can't admit where he was when this murder happened because he was with this girl and he doesn't want to sully her honor or whatever. So he ends up being beheaded. And of course, they're like, well, he was our friend, so let's take his brain and bring him back to life, right? So and then his girlfriend, who he was with, kills herself, drowns herself. So they take her body and put his brain in her body. Really creepy, weird stuff. But it's done pretty interestingly. And the girl who plays the Frankenstein monster in this case, although she doesn't look like a monster, she just looks like a young girl. It's really creepy stuff going on about his voice in her head because she has his brain, and it's creepy. It's some cool stuff. There's really a lot of cool stuff in Frankenstein Created Woman. Yet again, though, this movie took it to the extent where Frankenstein's just not evil. He's just not an evil guy at all. At all. So that was a problem. It wasn't until the next movie, which was Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed, the one that brought in Veronica Carlson. I think that was her first Hammer horror film. That returns us to an evil, sociopathic Baron von Frankenstein. I mean, he is evil in this one. Which is why it's called Frankenstein Must Be Destroyed. He rapes a woman at one point. He's blackmailing these people into helping him. He's trying to bring this one guy's specific brain back just so he can get some information from him, and takes him away from his wife. He could have been helping to reunite him with his wife. No, just take him away. I mean, he's an evil dude in that. And he gets the ending is pretty wow, as it says, Frankenstein must be destroyed. So there's an ending that's like, oh wow, what happens there? And so it's good. It's a good return to form, for the character, which makes it a little bit more monstrous, makes it a better monster movie, I think. That's where I'm going to stop for the Frankenstein movies, though, because the next one was a remake of Curse of Frankenstein. Peter Cushing wasn't in that one. David Prowse actually played the Frankenstein's monster in that one, but we'll talk about that later. Then they did another one, Frankenstein versus the monster. I forget the title of it there, but Peter Cushing came back in that one to kind of give his role a swan song there. So we'll talk about those later. But an interesting, look, if you look at how the imprint that Hammer Horror put on the character of Frankenstein, both Dr. Frankenstein and the creations that he made. It's an interesting one. It didn't take, meaning that other companies or other people that would go on to make Frankenstein movies always went back to the first story. They always went back to that first creation, the first creature, or the first novel. They never really ran with the idea of, well, let's just make Baron Frankenstein the main character. They didn't go with that. All right, yeah, Monster from Hell, Frankenstein and the Monster of Hell. You're right, Joel. That's the last in the series. So we'll talk about that and horror of Frankenstein next time. Crystal Ashes, thank you so much for the Professor Geek memberships. Appreciate that. Very much appreciated. And my dear Sound Engraver says, I like the theme of the body and mind being intricately linked. Yeah, I like that too. I thought that was really interesting. You're really fascinating because, I mean, no one's done an actual brain transplant. That's not a thing in real life. Don't know if they could ever actually do that. You think about, I mean, it gets into a lot of metaphysics, right? Where, especially if you believe in the existence of the soul or the spirit, is there a physical organ in which the soul or spirit resides? You would think the brain. So does that mean if you put your brain in another body, you would be you, but just in a different body? That's the science fiction, aspect that's usually taken, but I don't think it's that simple, of course, because you are your body and your soul and your spirit. It's a whole amalgamation, especially from a Christian, or especially from a Catholic theological standpoint. So, Nathaniel Lozball said, I heard Peter Cushing was just as uncomfortable with filming that scene as Veronica Carlson was. Yeah, I was listening to a lot of interviews, and Peter Cushing, what a classy guy. I mean, it's a movie in was that 1970 or something like that. So you don't see it happening, but you see enough to know it is happening, right? And she said how he was just such a gentleman with her. He was married, of course, so he loved his wife dearly. There was never any kind of, oh, he was a man about the set, or anything like that. Everybody said what a gentleman he was. He and Christopher Lee, I've heard the same thing about both of them, especially in the later Dracula movies where they have to do these promotional shots and like all these, like in Dracula AD, there's all these girls, scantily clad girls, around Dracula for the promotional shots, but he's just being the gentleman there, So, yeah.